Well, hello and welcome back to Gospel First. I'm your host, Joe Cirillo, and I'm grateful that you've come back today. As always, this isn't about perfect understanding. It's about real relationship with Jesus. 10 minutes a day offered faithfully keeps our hearts close. Today we're in Mark chapter 14, and this chapter is holy ground. Here we watch love under pressure, devotion, betrayal, fear, failure, all in the same story. And right in the middle of it, we see what Jesus is like. He stays. So if you're carrying regret, weakness, or a fear that you won't be faithful enough, today is for you. So let's get started. Well, Mark chapter 14, verses 1 to 9, it's all about the love that sees the moment. Jesus is in Bethany. A woman comes with an alabaster box of precious ointment. In verse 3, she brake the box and poured it on his head. Some criticize her. Why was the waste of the ointment made? In verse 4. But Jesus defends her in verse 6. She hath wrought a good work on me. Then he says something tender. She has come beforehand to anoint my body to the burying, in verse 8. She senses what others miss. Love often recognizes sacred moments before logic does. So what's the principle? Love offered freely to Christ is never, ever wasted. Next, in verses 10 to 11, betrayal begins quietly. Mark here shifts abruptly, and Judas Iscariot went unto the chief priest to betray him. That's in verse 10. And they promised money in verse 11. Betrayal does not begin with hatred. It begins when something else becomes more valuable than love. So here's something to think about. Where am I tempted to protect myself rather than trust Jesus? What quietly competes for my loyalty? Next, in Mark chapter 14, 12 to 26, this is my body. Jesus gathers his disciples for the Passover. During the meal, verse 22, Jesus took bread and he said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he takes the cup. "This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many." That's in verse 24. Jesus gives himself, knowing betrayal is near. Now, love does not withdraw to protect itself. It offers itself anyway. So what's the principle? Jesus gives himself fully, even knowing the cost. Next, confidence meets weakness. That's in verses 27 to 31 of chapter 14. Jesus tells them in verse 27, "All ye shall be offended because of me this night." Peter insists, "Although all shall be offended, yet will not I," in verse 29. Peter means it, but sincerity is not the same as strength. So here's something to think about. Where do I overestimate my own spiritual strength? Do I allow Jesus to warn me gently? Next, in verses 32 to 42, Gethsemane is where honest prayer is given. Jesus goes to Gethsemane. "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful unto death," he says in verse 34. And he prays, "Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me." That's in verse 36. Then he adds in verse 36, "Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt." Now this is not weakness. This is surrender. Jesus brings his fear honestly to God. So what's the principle? True obedience includes honest prayer, not silent suffering. Next, in Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 52, there's the arrest without resistance. Here Judas arrives, and he that betrayed him gave them a token, saying, "Whosoever I shall kiss, that same is he." That's verse 44. One disciple draws a sword in verse 47, and Jesus stops it. "Suffer ye thus far," in verse 49. Jesus does not defend himself with force. He chooses the path of sacrifice. Next, In verses 66 to 72, Peter's denial. Peter is questioned 3 times. I know not this man of whom ye speak. That's in verse 71. Then the cock crew in verse 72. Peter remembers Jesus' words in verse 72. And when he thought thereon, he wept. Now, failure does not end Peter's story, but it does pass through tears. So in closing, I want you to think about this. Mark chapter 14 shows us a Savior who stays when misunderstood, when betrayed, when abandoned, when suffering. And he shows disciples who fail, but are not forgotten. So if today you feel weak, or regretful, or afraid that you won't be faithful enough, remember this. Jesus stayed when it cost everything, so that even when we fall, we are not lost. Grace begins here. Well, that's it for another day. Thank you once again for staying faithful to the journey. May the Spirit continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. If your heart feels even a gentle nudge, I once again invite you to subscribe, like, and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And I'll see you next time as we continue walking with Mark in Mark chapter 15. Until then, God bless.